Israel's the canary in the coal mine, and Western values are under threat. Western societies are divided, and there are major conflicts ongoing in the world. And unless Australia stands alongside the United States, the United Kingdom, other European countries and other free nations to defend a country like Israel against a jihadist terrorist group like Hamas, then the consequences, I think, for the free world are very dire.
Hello and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Eylon Levy. Since October 7th, the Jewish community in Australia has felt shocked by the sudden resurgence of anti-Semitism. A force never seen before here in Australia, something they thought they had left far, far away in Europe. Indeed, Australia home to the largest population of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel. But anti-Semitism is now a force in Australian politics, and Jews are feeling abandoned, betrayed, seeing the hostility to Israel increasingly becoming direct attacks against Jews here down under. My guest today is Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer in the last Australian government, the Liberal government. Josh Frydenberg is the highest serving Jewish Member of Parliament in Australia's history. He was sworn in with a kippah and a chumash, and he recently produced a documentary for Sky News Australia, Never Again, the fight against anti-Semitism. Worried about where this is going, trying to wake up his fellow countrymen and fellow citizens to understand where anti-Semitism can lead. Because most people in Australia do not want this hatred, do not want this prejudice, but need help understanding where it has come from and where it can take their country if they're not careful. It is a stark wake-up call. Josh Frydenberg joins me here on location in Melbourne, Australia, to discuss the new anti-Semitism here and the connection to the increasingly deranged hostility towards Israel. Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
Eylon. What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
Mr. Frydenberg, welcome to State of a Nation.
Nice to be with you, Eylon.
Filmed on location here in Melbourne, Australia.
Welcome to Australia.
The Jewish community of Australia thought that they had gone to the ends of the earth and left the anti-Semitism of the old world behind them. And increasingly since October 7th, they're discovering it's back. Now, you recently produced a documentary, doco you call it here in Australia, for Sky News, Never Again, reporting on the new rise of anti-Semitism here down under. Tell me, how bad is it really? And what did you discuss in that documentary?
Look, it's extremely bad, and you're right that Australia provided a warm embrace to tens of thousands of Jewish families who came from the horrors of the Holocaust. And they prospered here, and they contributed here to society. In fact, Jews have been in Australia ever since the first fleet arrived from the United Kingdom. And in that time, Australians have risen to the highest places, the highest positions in society. We've had 2 governors general. We've had the chief of Army, we've had chief justices, and we've had leading sporting and cultural and artistic figures.
And not least yourself as the Treasurer of Australia in the previous government.
And there have been representatives in the Parliament. But since October the 7th, Jews in Australia have felt very unsafe, and they've actually felt abandoned by the government because there's been a series of events that have left them traumatised, notably the events outside the Sydney Opera House with statements like "fuck the Jews" and the burning of the Israeli flag. Mind you, which was just days after the horrors of October the 7th and well before Israel had even launched its response. There was a riot in the predominantly Jewish suburb of Caulfield. There was the doxing of more than 600 Jewish creative artists, which led to some receiving death threats and others seeing their businesses closed. Jewish artists who are household names across our country, like the singer Deborah Conway, have been cancelled from gigs. And of course, Jewish-owned businesses have been boycotted, openly so, by the pro-Hamas radicals in this country. And with all these events taking place, the governments, federal and state, have effectively been silent. They may have sometimes mouthed the right words, but they certainly haven't followed them up with action. And there's been a failure of leadership, Eylon, here in Australia across the board, a failure of our institutions. Our Human Rights Commission, which should be trying to prevent anti-Semitism and racism, has been inactive and ineffective. We've seen law enforcement not hold people accountable for what are clear breaches of the law. And we've seen our universities descend into chaos and become unsafe places for Jewish students and staff. And of course, our politicians have not done enough to enforce the law and to very clearly articulate the red lines that must not be crossed.
Help me understand why you think that the Australian leadership has not cracked down or taken seriously this problem of anti-Semitism, because you mentioned a word there I think that was very apt. People feel betrayed, they feel abandoned. They thought that Australia was a warm, embracive, multicultural community, and they feel shocked. I've spoken to so many Australian Jews who say that their friends, their neighbours have turned on them since October 7th. And so I'm wondering whether the failure of the government to take anti-Semitism seriously is because they too are baffled that anti-Semitism has reared its head and don't understand the nature of the threat. Or is it not that?
Well, probably it's a combination of factors, and particularly a reckless indifference to the position that the local Jewish community finds themselves in. The government has said at times, for example, the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is a very violent statement. The Prime Minister said that in my very documentary, and he said that it had no place on our streets, yet it is still being mouthed regularly on our streets. So too the term, globalising the Intifada. And the law has not been enforced in these instances, and that is a real failure of leadership. And I feel that the government has failed to appreciate just how broken social cohesion and social harmony has become as a result of the events since October the 7th.
Where is this anti-Semitism coming from? Specifically, what parts of society? Is this a question of the far left and what I've heard some people refer to as the increasing Corbynisation of the Australian Labor Party? Is it coming from Australia's growing Muslim community, which now outnumbers Jews here by 9-1? Or is it coming, in fact, from the far right of Australian politics? Where is it coming from?
I think it's a pincer movement from both the left and the right. But you'd be familiar with the term that anti-Semitism is a light sleeper, and it's not new. It's been around for thousands of years, but here in Australia, it's been largely absent, or it's at least been out on the fringes, and there's been a number of reasons for that. Namely, as I said to you, the heroics of previous outstanding Jewish Australians like Sir John Monash, who was Australia's leading general during the First World War. But where it's coming from now predominantly is the far left, and this notion that the Palestinians are the oppressed, Israel is the oppressor, Israel is the mighty, the Palestinians are the weak, and therefore Israel is bad and the others are good. And we've got ourselves into the situation here on our streets where people have not put in context the events of October the 7th, the massacre of 1,200 innocents and the taking of more than 200 hostages. And for many of these protesters, those terrible events of October the 7th have been justified in their mind as a legitimate resistance, and we know that to be wrong. So what we've seen on the left is the political party of the Greens partner with the Socialist Alliance, the Antifa groups, elements of the Labor Party as the mainstream governing party of the centre-left. And therefore, in what they've been doing is promoting Zionism as racism, and they've been promoting an anti-Israel rhetoric, and they've been holding Jews here in Australia accountable for events that have taken place thousands of kilometres from our shores.
Anti-Semitism, you say, is a light sleeper. It's also said that it's a shape-shifting virus. It changes in every generation. And I'm noticing that many of the examples that you mention are specifically linked to Israel, not the classic anti-Semitism of Jews controlling the banks and having horns, but links to Israel. And I'm wondering whether this hostility is touching Australian Jews at a particularly sensitive spot, because the community here is so closely linked to Israel. So many have friends and family who live there, they visit there so often. Help me understand how that hostility to Israel has spilled over into prejudice against Jews here in Australia.
Well, I think October the 7th was the spark for what has always been there among many of those who are protesting, which is an inability to recognise Israel's right to exist. And that, at the heart of it, if you scratch the surface of many of the protesters, that's what they really believe. For many of them, it's not about... I
don't think you have to scratch the surface, is what they say quite openly.
Yeah, it's not about a two-state solution. It's about a one-state solution. So for them and for many of their fellow travellers, Israel's illegitimacy in their eyes is a justification for the violence and the harassment that we're seeing on our streets.
You discuss in your documentary the case of Maggie and Joshua Moshe, who had a shop that isn't thriving at the moment. Tell me about that story and some of the personal examples of how Australian Jews have been suffering from this anti-Semitism.
So they were victims of the doxing event.
Tell us about the doxing event. It will not be familiar to people across the world.
So 600 Jewish creatives. In the case of Josh Moshe, he's a well-known local musician. Their personal details and their correspondence on a WhatsApp chat group was made public. As a result, they received violent threats against their family once their personal details were made public, as being supporters of the State of Israel and proud Australian Jews. Their 5-year-old was actually the recipient one of those death threats. Their shop was vandalised and attacked. They were attacked on social media, so much so that their shop in the northern suburbs of Melbourne had to be closed down. And now they've moved to another location. And I profiled their example as just one of many in the documentary of real-life painful consequences as a result of the anti-Semitism that's been unleashed after the events of October the 7th.
And since October 7th, I think you're finding that the failure to stand up to lies against Israel has led an increasingly deranged movement that is importing political violence to Australia that Australia is not used to. I visited the office of Josh Burns, MP from the Labour Party, whose office was firebombed. They'd daubed "Zionism is fascism" on the window. And so I'm wondering how you see, in particular, the government's policy on Israel as perhaps fueling the far left of Australian politics that has made hostility to Israel its central cause.
Well, ever since Israel's establishment, there's been a strong degree of bipartisan support for its existence here in Australia. Indeed, a former Labor leader called Doc Evatt was the president of the United Nations General Assembly at the time of Israel's formation in 1948. And then other prominent Labor prime ministers like Bob Hawke was a well-known supporter of the refuseniks and helping to get them out of Russia into Israel. Julia Gillard, who was featured in this documentary, Australia's first female prime minister, another very strong supporter of the State of Israel.
What happened?
And what has happened now is that degree of bipartisanship has been abandoned. And where the Labor Party and the government find themselves is changing their votes, no longer in support or steadfast support of the State of Israel, and no longer providing the warm embrace to Israel at a time of great need, which is under the in the war that we now find ourselves in. So much so that the current Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has not visited Israel, while many other world leaders have since October the 7th. And the Foreign Minister of Australia, who did visit Israel, couldn't even bring herself to visit Kibbutz Be'eri, the site of one of the massacres on October the 7th. That has been more than disheartening, more than disappointing for the Australian Jewish community. It's been absolutely hard to take, because the Jewish community here is much better served when there is a strong degree of bipartisanship, both for the State of Israel, but also against local anti-Semitism.
And that shift, do you think, is just part of the global shift of left-wing parties against Israel, that around the world it has become a partisan issue? Could you perhaps talk to the influence of the Green Party here in Australia and how they're tugging on the Labour Party and pulling them to the left?
Yeah, the Green Party is a minor party here, but it's also a feeder party in terms of votes for the Labor Party. And they couldn't even bring themselves to condemn the defacing of the war memorials here in Australia with pro-Palestinian sentiment. They couldn't even bring themselves, to openly condemn Hamas or indeed provide support for a two-state solution. So they have been dangerous in the words and their actions since October the 7th. But to your question about the broader movement around the world, I think it is true that here in Australia, the government has followed the paths of the Trudeau government and indeed the Starmer government in the United Kingdom and other centre-left governments in walking away from their traditional support for the State of Israel.
And that shift is perhaps surprising, because the impression I had after October 7th was that Australia was gunning for Israel to win this war. It didn't vote at the United Nations in favour of the first ceasefire resolution. And when it voted for a ceasefire, it said this can only be sustainable if Hamas lays down its arms. And then Hamas proceeded to tell Australia to get stuffed. It didn't release the hostages. It didn't lay down its arms. And when Australia now calls for a ceasefire, I've been telling people the government knows that is going to be unsustainable, that it will start the clock ticking towards Hamas's next war, because they've said that a ceasefire cannot be sustainable as long as Hamas still has its arms. And so I'm wondering, how do you understand the government's policy, the Labour government's policy, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th? And why do you think that it shifted, given that it was a very clearly pro-Israel policy when they were still shocked by Hamas's barbaric attacks?
Don't get me wrong, there's no love on behalf of even this Labor government for Hamas. I mean, Hamas is a listed terrorist organisation here in Australia, and its actions have been condemned. There's also, great concern about the loss of civilian life on both sides of this conflict. But I think as time has gone on and it's extended into months, not weeks, and soon to tick over a year since October the 7th, the government has joined with other countries to push for the ceasefire. But as you say, there's a real question. If there is a ceasefire and the return of hostages, will that allow an opportunity for Hamas to regroup and then come again? So I visited Israel earlier this year. I found a country that was traumatised. I found a country that was politically divided. But I also found a country that was extremely united in what the war aims are. And those war aims are to defeat Hamas, to return the hostages, and to see Israelis from the north of the country return to their homes. I would hope that any Australian government, whatever its political hue or persuasion, would agree to those objectives as well.
Well, help me understand why they should, because from my perspective, Australia is on the other side of the globe. There is political pressure on the Labour Party to abandon Israel. They're being pulled by the Greens, increasing competition for the votes of Muslim voters who are more sympathetic to Palestinians. And from a political perspective, it would seem they have nothing to lose by breaking with Israel, whether it's tripling funding to UNRWA or recognizing a Palestinian state, becoming more hostile. And I'm wondering, why do you think that the Australian-Israeli relationship, the Aussie-Israeli mateship, matters? Why is that an alliance that an Australian government should preserve?
Well, it should matter, and it has mattered, and it will matter into the future. And governments here need to recognise, particularly the security and the political ties, how important that is to preserving Australian life. Israeli intelligence, as was said on the documentary by both the former head of the Defence Department here in Australia and the former Defence Minister of Australia, has saved Australian lives, and that will be the situation in the future as well, as long as the relationship is preserved. So from my perspective, Australia's national interest is absolutely promoted by strong ties between Australia and Israel, recognising that Israel is the only democracy in a sea of hostility in the Middle East.
Can you elaborate on that? Because I think many people would think that Australia needn't concern itself with security issues so far away, and here you are saying essentially that Israel's security contributes directly to Australia's security. You mentioned intelligence, and I'm wondering, in what other ways does Israel's security against the Iranian regime and the proxy armies attacking it on 7 fronts, why does Israel's security matter to Australia?
Well, as we know, Iran has deployed a ring of fire against Israel and working through its proxies. And by its very nature, that's destabilising not just to the Middle East, but more broadly. And Australia is no friend of Russia. And indeed, we've been on the side of Ukraine, yet Iran's partner in the war on terror is with Russia as well. And North Korea, again, no friend of Australia. And so what we're seeing here is a broader conflict play out. And this is why what happens with Israel matters to the Western world and to the free world, because Israel's the canary in the coal mine, and Western values are under threat. Western societies are divided, and there are major conflicts ongoing in the world. And unless Australia stands alongside the United States, the United Kingdom, other European countries and other free nations to defend a country like Israel against a jihadist terrorist group like Hamas, then the consequences, I think, for the free world are very dire.
Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, Israel is a democracy. Australia's been alongside Israel from day one, and the war against Hamas, the war against Hezbollah, the war against the Iranian proxies in Iraq and in Syria are wars effectively against all the things that we value, and that's why Israel's fight is the Western world's fight.
And are you concerned that if the government in Australia fails to take seriously the question of Israel's security and goes along with some of the increasingly unhinged lies that are being told about Israel, that it not only will undermine Israel's security in a way that undermines the security of the Western world and therefore Australia, but also that the failure to do so will fuel more domestic division and animosity inside Australia by allowing Israel to be demonized in such a way? How do you understand that linkage?
That's a really important point, and that it always starts with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. And if we allow anti-Semitism to continue to build the momentum that it has, then the impact on social cohesion and domestic harmony will be even more significant over time. And that is not in Australia's interest. And you referred to the way Israel is being marginalised in the world, and also the lies, the misinformation, the disinformation that is being spread. And here in Australia on our streets, you hear that Israel is a genocidal country, that Israel is an apartheid state, that Israel is a colonial state. And I think it's important that all good people push back on that demonisation about Israel, because we know it's not a colonial state. You only have to go back and understand the history of Jerusalem to see more than 3,000 years of Jewish history. We know it's not an apartheid state with Arabs sitting on the Supreme Court and other key institutions with Israel. And indeed, in my documentary, I interviewed a well-known Arab-Israeli journalist, Khaled Abu Toma, who said, if Israel was an apartheid state, I wouldn't be living in a Jewish neighbourhood. My daughter wouldn't be attending a Jewish university. And we know Israel is not a genocidal state. It's actually fighting a genocidal opponent in Hamas that doesn't believe in the state of Israel. And the real genocide, among others in the world, was of course the Holocaust. And to know that in 1936 there were 16.6 million Jews in the world, but today there is 16.1 million. That's what a genocide looks like. And we also know that if we don't stop anti-Semitism today, it can end in the horrors like we saw in World War II. And no one wants to see that repeat. And that's why none of us can be a bystander in this current conflict.
That's a very bold projection to make. Anti-Semitism in Australia is surely not that far gone that you would take it to scenarios like that.
My point is, we know where anti-Semitism leads globally, and we all have an obligation to call it out. No one is predicting a repeat of World War II anytime soon. But you hear from the Holocaust survivors themselves.
Australia, of course, having the biggest population of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel.
You hear from the Holocaust survivors themselves in my documentary that nobody growing up in Europe in the 1930s could have anticipated Auschwitz, could have anticipated the extermination of Jews on that great scale. Yet you hear from Holocaust survivors in my documentary that what they are seeing playing out on the streets of Australia today and in other Western countries, for them, has echoes of the 1930s. And that's who we should listen to, because it's their experience, Eylon, which is most powerful and most worrying.
And that's truly terrifying, the thought that anti-Semitism could have reached proportions that it is traumatizing and triggering for Holocaust survivors here in Australia. And so I'm wondering if we shift from wallowing in concern about abandonment and betrayal towards action. You say the Australian government has not done enough. What do you expect it to do?
Enforce the law.
Specifically, which law?
The law about inciting hatred and violence. As you know, in Australia, as in the United States and the United Kingdom, our universities have been ground zero for anti-Semitism with these campus encampments of hate. Yet our vice-chancellors and chancellors have said, walk around the camps. They're practicing free speech. No, they're not. They're actually endangering the safety of Jewish students and Jewish staff. So closing down campus camps of hate, closing down the people who are inciting hatred and harassing students in the classroom is a good start. Stopping people from calling for the extinction of Israel with the term from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Stopping people from promoting Hamas with their flags and Hezbollah with their flags on the streets of our capital cities, or indeed the streets of capital cities within the United States. That's what needs to be taken head on. There needs to be consequences for this action rather than green lights being given as people have crossed red lines.
If I can push back, I think playing devil's advocate, the government would say that what you're calling for is essentially restrictions on the free speech rights of Australians to criticise the policies in a war and of a country far, far away. This is a question of open discussion about foreign policy. Why should you crack down on that?
It's absolutely fair enough to have a view about Israeli government policies and about ceasefires or not. That's absolutely legitimate. What is not legitimate is to create an unsafe environment on our streets, on our campuses, in our schools. And that is what is actually in our workplaces. And that is actually what has taken place in Australia. In the documentary, Eylon, I interview Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister, a great friend of Israel, a man called John Howard, who's from the Liberal Party on the centre-right. And I put it to him, that very question, is this just the exercise of free speech? And he said no, because it's a common sense test. When you are inciting violence and hatred, you are actually breaching that notion of free speech, and that should not be allowed. And that's where the law needs to be brought into effect.
Any words of comfort, confidence, succour you would give to Jewish community and especially Jewish students on campuses?
There's a couple of things I would say, Eylon. The first is Israel will survive. Israel will prosper. And the Holocaust, Israel was not established because the Holocaust happened, but the Holocaust happened because Israel was not established. So for all Jews around the world, we need Israel to be strong, and we need Israel to defeat its enemies like Hamas. And there have been many times when the Jewish people have encountered enemies over thousands of years, and they have, at some cost, been triumphant in the end. So the first thing I'd say is Israel will survive. The second thing I would say is I do believe there is a silent majority of good people in Australia who know what has happened with anti-Semitism in our country since October the 7th is unacceptable. And I also know that bad things happen when good people remain silent. So my documentary and the other actions many people are taken are all designed to galvanise people into action. And I've been stopped on the street many times since the documentary aired, said, thank you for bringing these events into our living room. Thank you for making us aware, and as a consequence, we are going to openly, publicly, and strongly support the Jewish community in Australia. And for me, that's a sign that the message is starting to be heard.
And that's so important to awaken people to action, because the vast majority of people in Australia are fundamentally good, decent people who want to have a welcoming, democratic country, but I think need help understanding what is going on at the extremes and to be able to push back and stamp out and understand where it's leading. Mr. Frydenberg, if the Australian government doesn't take this issue seriously enough, can we see your own return to frontline politics?
Look, I'm very, very comfortable spending time with my family and working in the private sector. I do stay connected to politics, and I'd never say never about a return. But right now, it's the opposition here in Australia who, and we have an election coming up soon, who have been consistent and strong in supporting Israel and the Jewish community. And that, to me and to many others across the country, is heartening.
Never say never, not never again. Mr. Frydenberg, how can people watch your documentary and stay in touch and follow your work?
It's free on YouTube, and hopefully you can provide a link to your viewers to turn it on.
We will share it in the podcast notes.
And the other point, Eylon, is what has transpired in Australia has truly been disgraceful since October the 7th. But in many ways, it's no different to what has transpired on the streets of Montreal, in the streets of New York, and on the streets of London. So this documentary could be made again in other countries and should be made again in other countries because the story needs to be told, and I wanted to use my voice to take this message to as many Australians as possible. Never again. It's our fight, Jew and non-Jew alike, against anti-Semitism.
Josh Frydenberg, thank you for joining me on State of a Nation.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation with former Australian Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, filmed on location in Melbourne, Australia. As always, if you enjoy these podcasts, please follow and subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, give us a good review, share it with friends, and please watch Josh Frydenberg's documentary on anti-Semitism for Sky News Australia, Never Again. We'll feature the link in the podcast notes. A timely reminder of the importance to nip anti-Semitism in the bud before it gets out of control. I'm Eylon Levy, and thanks for joining us.